The macabre history of the Wendells. A rich widow raised 10 kids in silence and darkness. The discovery of the Wendell family's terrible secret came not through investigation or accident, but through the inevitable failure of human systems to sustain themselves indefinitely without external contact. On a gray November morning in 2019, emergency responders in the wealthy suburb of Greenwich, Connecticut, were called to investigate a report of smoke emanating from the windows of Blackwood Manor, a Gothic revival mansion that had stood silent and seemingly abandoned for over 2 decades. What firefighters found when they forced entry into the estate would challenge every assumption about family privacy, mental illness, and the ability of wealth to shield the most devastating forms of child abuse from public scrutiny. Inside the mansion, they discovered 10 individuals ranging in age from 12 to 32, all pale as ghosts and blinking painfully in the sudden intrusion of daylight. Children and young adults who had been raised in perpetual darkness and enforced silence by their mother, Victoria Wendell. Victoria Wendell had been a prominent figure in Connecticut society during the 1980s and early 1990s, known for her charitable work and marriage to pharmaceutical heir Jonathan Wendell. But following Jonathan's sudden death in 1999, Victoria had withdrawn from all social contact, sealing herself and her children inside the family estate in what neighbors had assumed was an extended period of mourning that had simply never ended. Mansion that emergency responders entered was a testament to wealth turned pathological. Every window had been boarded shut from the inside, plunging the interior into a darkness so complete that the family had been living by candlelight and oil lamps for 20 years. Heavy curtains and blackout materials had been layered over them, boards, ensuring that no trace of natural light could penetrate the oppressive gloom that Victoria had created for her children. But perhaps more disturbing than the darkness was the silence. Victoria had established a household rule that conversation was forbidden except during designated hours, and even then only in whispers that wouldn't disturb what she called the peace of mourning. The children had been conditioned to communicate, primarily through gestures and written notes, living their entire lives in a hushed atmosphere that resembled a tomb more than a home. The 10 Wendell children presented a sight that would haunt the emergency responders for years to come. Their skin was translucent from decades without sunlight, their eyes oversized and adapted to the perpetual darkness, their movements slow and careful as if they had never learned to navigate a world with normal lighting. They wore simple, dark clothing that appeared to be handmade, and they moved through their shadowy environment with the practiced efficiency of people who had spent their entire lives in artificial twilight. Most shocking was their reaction to the sudden intrusion of light and sound. The children cowered from the firefighters' flashlights as if the beams caused physical pain, and they seemed unable to comprehend the reality of strangers in their sealed world. They communicated with each other through subtle gestures and nearly inaudible whispers, displaying a form of sign language that they had apparently developed to function within their mother's regime of enforced silence. Victoria Wendell herself appeared to be in her late 50s, but looked decades older, her hair white and her skin the same translucent pallor as her children. She greeted the emergency responders with a calm politeness that was more unsettling than hysteria, explaining that the smoke had come from a minor kitchen fire that she had already extinguished. She seemed genuinely confused by the responders' concern and insisted that her family was perfectly fine and required no assistance. When firefighters attempted to assess the children's welfare, Victoria's demeanor shifted to protective hostility. She explained that her children were delicate and had been raised according to specific principles that protected them from the corruption and violence of the outside world. They had been educated at home, provided with all necessary care, and raised in an environment of peace and spiritual contemplation that she believed was superior to conventional child-rearing. The mansion itself told a story of gradual descent into isolation and pathology. The first floor had been converted into a series of communal spaces where the family conducted their daily activities in semi-darkness. The second floor contained bedrooms that resembled monastic cells, each furnished with only a bed, a small table, and religious artifacts. The third floor had been converted into educational spaces where Victoria had apparently been providing her children with instruction in reading, writing, mathematics, and religious studies. But it was the basement that revealed the true extent of Victoria's psychological deterioration. The lower level of the mansion had been converted into what could only be described as a shrine to her deceased husband. Jonathan Wendell's personal effects had been preserved exactly as they were at the time of his death, and the space was filled with photographs, memorabilia, and personal items that Victoria had been maintaining as if he were still alive. The basement also contained extensive documentation of Victoria's gradual withdrawal from the outside world and her developing belief system about the necessity of protecting her children from what she viewed as an increasingly corrupt and dangerous society. Her handwritten journals, dating back to 1999, revealed a progressive descent into paranoia and delusion that had transformed grief into a pathological need to control every aspect of her children's environment. The journals chronicled Victoria's growing conviction that the outside world posed existential threats to her children's spiritual and physical well-being. She had become obsessed with news reports of violence, substance abuse, sexual exploitation, and moral decay, interpreting these as evidence that normal society was unsuitable for raising pure and innocent children. Her solution had been to create what she called the sanctuary, a completely controlled environment where her children could be protected from all external influences while being raised according to principles of silence, contemplation, and spiritual purity that would preserve their innocence indefinitely. The financial records discovered in Victoria's study revealed that she had been systematically converting the family's assets into forms that would support their isolated lifestyle indefinitely. She had liquidated investments, sold properties, and restructured the family fortune to provide a steady income that could maintain the mansion and provide for her children's basic needs without requiring any external contact. More disturbing was the discovery that Victoria had been preparing for the possibility that her children might never leave the mansion. She had stockpiled food, medical supplies, and educational materials sufficient to last for decades, and had made legal arrangements that would provide for the family's financial needs long after her death. The children themselves, when finally interviewed by child welfare specialists, presented a complex picture of individuals who had been simultaneously protected and damaged by their mother's extreme isolation. They were remarkably well educated in certain subjects, possessing advanced knowledge of literature, philosophy, and religious studies that exceeded most conventionally educated individuals their age, but they also displayed profound deficits in social development, emotional expression, and practical life skills that made their integration into normal society extremely challenging. They had no understanding of contemporary technology, current events, or social customs that most people took for granted. They seemed to exist in a temporal bubble that had preserved them from the passage of time while preventing them from developing the capabilities necessary for independent life. Most disturbing was their complete psychological dependence on their mother and their terror of the outside world. Victoria had succeeded in convincing them that the darkness and silence of their home was protection rather than imprisonment, and that exposure to normal society would corrupt or destroy them. Dr. Patricia Williams, a child psychologist brought in to assess the family's mental state, found evidence of systematic psychological conditioning that had created what amounted to a cult-like environment within the confines of a single household. Victoria had used her children's natural dependence and trust to create a belief system that made them willing participants in their own isolation. The children genuinely believed that they were privileged to live in the pure environment that their mother had created, and that the outside world was filled with dangers and corruptions that would harm them if they were exposed to normal social contact. They viewed their darkness and silence not as deprivation, but as spiritual discipline that elevated them above the chaos and materialism of conventional society. As authorities attempted to understand the scope of the psychological damage that had been inflicted on the Wendell children, they realized they were confronting a case that challenged conventional categories of child abuse and mental illness. Victoria had not subjected her children to obvious physical harm or deliberate cruelty, but she had systematically denied them the experiences and relationships necessary for normal human development. The investigation that would follow would reveal that the Wendell family's descent into isolation and pathology had been gradual and systematic, driven by Victoria's grief-induced paranoia and her growing conviction that protecting her children from the world required denying them access to the world entirely. The 10 pale figures who emerged blinking into the November daylight were living evidence that love could become a form of imprisonment, and that the desire to protect children could transform into the very force that destroyed their potential for happiness and fulfillment. The psychological investigation that followed the discovery of the Wendell family would reveal one of the most complex and disturbing cases of maternal pathology in modern American history, exposing how grief and trauma could transform protective love into a systematic form of psychological imprisonment that destroyed the very children it was meant to preserve. Dr. Margaret Chen, the forensic psychiatrist assigned to evaluate Victoria Wendell's mental state, discovered that the wealthy widow's descent into isolation and control had been triggered not just by her husband's death, but by a series of traumatic events that had shattered her ability to distinguish between protection and destruction. Jonathan Wendell's death in 1999 had been sudden and violent, the result of a carjacking in Hartford that had left Victoria traumatized and convinced that the outside world posed existential threats to anyone she loved. But investigation into the family's history revealed that Jonathan's death was only the latest in a series of tragedies that had shaped Victoria's worldview long before she became a mother. Victoria's own childhood had been marked by loss and trauma that had never been properly addressed. Born Victoria Ashford in 1962, she had lost both parents in a plane crash when she was 8 years old, leaving her to be raised by elderly grandparents who had dealt with their own grief by becoming increasingly isolated and protective. Victoria had grown up in an environment where fear of the outside world was presented as wisdom, and where isolation was viewed as the only reliable form of safety. Her marriage to Jonathan Wendell in 1987 had provided her with a sense of security and normalcy that had temporarily masked her underlying psychological fragility. Jonathan's pharmaceutical fortune had allowed them to create a comfortable life in Greenwich, and Victoria had thrown herself into charitable work and social activities that seemed to indicate successful adaptation to adult life. But Dr. Chen's analysis of Victoria's psychological development revealed that her apparent normalcy had been a carefully constructed facade that concealed deep-seated anxiety disorders, attachment trauma, and a worldview shaped by the conviction that love inevitably led to loss. She had managed her psychological vulnerabilities through control and predictability, creating routines and structures that gave her the illusion of safety. The birth of her children between 1987 and 1999 had intensified both Victoria's love and her fear, creating a psychological dynamic where her need to protect them became indistinguishable from her need to control them. She had begun implementing restrictions and limitations that seemed reasonable to outside observers, but that were actually manifestations of her growing paranoia about the dangers that threatened her family. Jonathan's violent death had shattered the psychological defenses that Victoria had constructed over decades, triggering a complete breakdown that manifested as an obsessive need to eliminate every possible source of danger from her children's lives. Her grief had transformed into a pathological conviction that the only way to protect her children was to remove them from the world entirely. Journals that investigators found in the mansion chronicled Victoria's psychological deterioration with disturbing clarity. In the months following Jonathan's death, she had become obsessed with news reports of violence, accidents, and social problems that confirmed her growing belief that the outside world was fundamentally unsafe for innocent people. She had begun restricting her children's activities and social contacts, initially presenting these limitations as temporary measures while the family grieved. But the restrictions had gradually expanded until they encompassed every aspect of the children's lives, transforming what had begun as protective caution into complete isolation. The implementation of darkness and silence had been the final stage of Victoria's systematic elimination of external influences from her children's environment. She had convinced herself that light and noise were forms of stimulation that agitated the mind and prevented the kind of spiritual peace that would protect her children from the corruption of modern society. Dr. Chin's evaluation revealed that Victoria had developed what could only be described as a delusional system that reframed her children's imprisonment as their salvation. She genuinely believed that she was providing them with a pure and sacred environment that would preserve their innocence and spirituality in ways that conventional upbringing could never achieve. The children's adaptation to their mother's restrictions provided disturbing evidence of how human beings could adjust to almost any environment when it was presented as normal and necessary. They had developed their own culture within the darkness and silence, creating forms of communication and social interaction that allowed them to maintain relationships while conforming to their mother's requirements. But psychological evaluation of the children revealed the devastating costs of their adaptation. They suffered from severe vitamin D deficiency, weakened immune systems, and physical development problems related to their lack of sunlight and exercise. More seriously, they displayed profound psychological deficits that might never be fully corrected through therapy and rehabilitation. The older children, who retained some memories of life before their mother's restrictions, showed signs of complex trauma and learned helplessness that made them incapable of imagining alternatives to their isolated existence. The younger children, who had never known anything other than darkness and silence, seemed to have developed entirely around these limitations, making their integration into normal society extremely challenging. Dr. Chin's most disturbing finding was that several of the children had begun to exhibit signs of the same psychological patterns that had driven their mother's behavior. They showed excessive anxiety about external threats, obsessive need for control over their environment, and difficulty forming relationships that weren't based on dependency and protection. The investigation revealed that Victoria had been systematically conditioning her children to replicate her own psychological dysfunction, creating a generational cycle of trauma and isolation that could have continued indefinitely if the fire had not brought outside intervention. Financial analysis of the family's resources showed that Victoria had indeed prepared for the possibility that her children would never leave the mansion. She had established trust funds and investment arrangements that could have supported their isolated lifestyle for decades, and had made legal provisions that would have allowed the older children to continue caring for the younger ones according to her specifications. The legal challenges were unprecedented. Victoria's actions had clearly caused severe psychological and physical harm to her children, but she had committed no obvious crimes and had genuinely believed she was acting in their best interests. Her mental illness had manifested as an extreme form of overprotective parenting that existed in a gray area between care and abuse. The children themselves were deeply conflicted about their situation. While they suffered from the effects of their isolation, they also maintained powerful emotional bonds with their mother and feared the outside world that they had been taught to view as dangerous and corrupting. Child welfare authorities faced the complex task of providing care for individuals who had been systematically conditioned to reject normal social relationships and environmental conditions. Traditional foster care and residential programs were inadequate for addressing the specific needs of children who had never experienced daylight, normal social interaction, or basic independence. The children were ultimately placed in specialized facilities designed to provide gradual exposure therapy while addressing their medical, psychological, and educational deficits. Some showed remarkable adaptability and eventually learned to function in normal environments, while others continued to struggle with basic aspects of independent living. Victoria Wendell was committed to a psychiatric facility, where she remained convinced that removing her children from their protective environment had doomed them to corruption and harm. She showed no insight into the damage her actions had caused, and continued to view herself as a devoted mother who had sacrificed everything to protect her children from a dangerous world. The case led to changes in Connecticut's child welfare laws, requiring more aggressive intervention in cases of extreme isolation and establishing protocols for identifying families that had withdrawn completely from social contact. But it also raised fundamental questions about the balance between family privacy and child protection that continue to influence policy debates. The macabre history of the Wendells revealed that some of the most devastating forms of child abuse could be committed by parents who genuinely loved their children and believed they were acting in their best interests. Victoria's psychological illness had transformed maternal love into a destructive force that consumed the very children she was trying to protect. The 10 pale figures who emerged from Blackwood Manor serve as living reminders that isolation and control, even when motivated by love and fear, can destroy human potential more effectively than obvious cruelty or neglect. Their ongoing recovery continues to influence understanding of trauma, family dysfunction, and the complex relationship between protection and development in child welfare. Their story warns that the greatest threats to children might not come from external dangers, but from internal family dynamics that transform love into imprisonment and protection into destruction. The price that the Wendell children paid for their mother's madness serves as evidence that good intentions without psychological health can create forms of harm that are far more subtle and devastating than deliberate cruelty. Thank you for watching another tale unfold here on NW Storytime. Every story hides a secret, and tonight you uncovered another one. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us keep the secrets alive. Until next time, stay curious,